Hey everyone, this is the first in a series of 5 videos that I'm going to be doing on the Devil May Cry series, with a focus on how the games themselves change from each increment into the next. My belief is that Devil May Cry is a series that after all this time, 5 major games in the franchise, is still a series that lacks direction and a fundamental base for what the players actually expect for it. Now, there's been highs and lows in the series, with a recent reboot that's been very 50-50 in regards to reaction to the game overall, as well as 4 main increments that have been in their own main timeline that most people who played the series have grown up with. And I'm going to go through the games one by one to just talk about them in general, as well as how they are different to one another, what they evolve, what they lose, what they gain from each sequel, what they try new, and so on and so forth. And with that, let's get into the first and the original game of the Devil May Cry series, but not the first chronologically, of course. Devil May Cry 1 on the PS2, the game that introduced us to Dante and his demon-slaying heroics. Now, I feel at this point it's a bit tedious to go into the overall pre-development of Devil May Cry. I feel like most fans of the series know that Devil May Cry originally started out as one of the possible increments of Resident Evil 4, and as such, the earlier Devil May Cry games do share a lot in structure with the Resident Evil series, and Devil May Cry the First is certainly one of them that has many shared connections to how Resident Evil operates as a game, in how its design works, how its gameplay kind of works, but more importantly the structure of the game and its bosses, and I'll talk about those when it gets time to actually talk about those subjects. Devil May Cry was a game that, in the interest of finding a good gameplay experience, when it looked like Resident Evil 4's prototype had become a bit too action heavy, it was spun off into its own game because it looked like it had potential, and given the series that have come up from this, I'd say they were bang on the money with that assessment. Devil May Cry is a simple action game, but it reinvented what it meant to have action in a 3D space, because it hadn't really been done yet. We'd had games that had attempted action like this, but for the most part the core action experience, if you wanted Twitch-based action, was still very much a 2D affair. So Devil May Cry brought us into the realm of 3D heavy, Twitch-based and stylish combat, which was something that no one had really tried up until that point. Of course, the story for Devil May Cry is relatively simple. Dante, demon hunter extraordinaire, is talked into by a lady who appears at his bar/office called Trish, who gets him to go to a island where the Lord of the Underworld, Mundus, is attempting to take over the world, and it's really as simple as that. There's a few twists and turns here and there throughout the game, but nothing you're not really expecting. One of the reoccurring bosses of the game is his long-lost brother, who's eventually shown out by the plot beats of the story over the 3 times you face him, and Trish is eventually revealed to be someone working against you, although, however, Dante himself as a character and his strength inspires Trish to rise up against her creator Mundus and actually help him fight Mundus and eventually go on to win the game, and save the world, of course. Of course, no game is good without its bread and butter, and that would be the gameplay. Combat in Devil May Cry is first and foremost one of the most rewarding things you will ever play in a video game. Dante has a lovely mix of swordplay and guns that you can mix up in between to juggle enemies in air with your pistols or any other projectile based weapon you choose to use during the game, because there's multiple to choose from, as well as weapons as well. The majority of the game you're going to find yourself swinging a sword, but you also have access to multiple kinds of swords with different traits and elements, as well as the Ifrit gauntlets that go on both the hands and feet and allow Dante to have a much more up close and personal way of fighting. Of course, there are other gameplay segments in the game as well that come up over time. There's some swimming elements that take place in the first person viewport, as well as a few flying gimmicks later on in the game. The final boss has a very Space Harrier reference style of fighting, as well as a little flying section as well with a biplane at the end of the game, and another little homage to Resident Evil, or perhaps just another hangover from Resident Evil, however you want to see it. Of course, for the most part, you're probably going to find yourself switching between the weapons you find yourself most comfortable with. And for me, that's nearly always a Lester, but but Ifrit has his own strengths and weaknesses, and certain weapons are always set up for certain places in the game. There's no one weapon in the game that will get you through every situation nice and easy, and you're always pushed to make the best combination of what you can use, as well as mixing whatever stuff you have equipped up to get nice stylish combos, and that's what it's all about. You attack frequently with pace without getting hit, and you'll get your stylish ranking up, and that's the point of the game. To kill demons and look good doing it, and Dante with his cocky attitude certainly does that. So let's talk about the characters. Obviously we have our lead for the game and prime playable character, Dante. Cocky demon hunter, loves to wear red, and seemingly seems to be indestructible outside of when you're playing him. He gets swords thrown from him, things explode in his face, and various other things throughout the series do constantly go through his body. Not only does he escape unsafe, his clothing seems equally devoid of damage at all times, so clearly we all need to be getting his tailor if we're going to some sort of combat situation. But he's the hero of the game, and while he is corny most of the times, he's a very cocky, attituded person. Always fun to watch, and is perfect for this kind of game. Someone who actually tries to kill things and look good doing it, and his attitude just backs that up. He's always cocky, but he's always got heart in what he does as well, and that's ultimately what makes Trish fall for him. He's a great character, someone who stays in your memory, someone who's fun and simple at the same time. He's someone who makes the Devil May Cry series worth playing, because a combat game is just a combat game, but a combat game with fun characters make you want to keep coming back for more. Secondly, however, I want to talk about Virgil in this game, or Nero Angelo, depending on how you want to pronounce it for this game. Obviously, Arsnell's Japanese interchangeable. It could be Nero Angelo, or it could be Nero Angelo. Whatever you want to go with, really, and I like Nero Angelo, personally myself, and we're not likely to get a perfect translation of that anyway. But you fight him 3 times during the game, and after the first encounter when he runs off after getting a glimpse of Dante's necklace, it sets up after reading the item descriptions that you can get, but he may in fact be Dante's long lost brother. It's not really delved into too well, and most of it all has to be read into to get the most of the story from it, and I think that works really well for a simple game like this. Obviously the first in the series doesn't want to go too much into that kind of history because it's not the focus of the game, but it makes a fantastic setup for maybe a prequel at some point to actually explore what happened between the 2 brothers, or how Virgil came to be missing in the first place. And well, I think we know how that turned out, or at least you will do by the 3rd video in this series. But Virgil, despite being nothing more than a pawn that works for Mundus, does actually retain a sort of sense of his former self. Obviously he recognises Dante after seeing the necklace, or more, he recognises the necklace, which is enough to jog his memories, but he has a sense of honour as well. He's always fought on his own without influx of other demons or anything else trying to get in the way. It's a one-on-one, and it always feels like a personal vendetta. Plus, given that he's human-like with a giant sword, it makes for an interesting parallel between fighting him, because you're fairly equal on grounds as well. Obviously, the main heroine, and perhaps only female character outside of a few feminine enemies to appear in the game, would be Trish, and Trish has a bit of an effect on Dante because she looks like his mother. As we later find out during the game, Mundus actually created Trish, so that's probably done with that in mind, something that would help her be more persuasive to him. And I think Dante in Trish sees a lot more of his past and his mother, and it's what makes him so willing to save her, and ultimately that decision pays back on him as well, as Trish sides with Dante and not Mundus, and without her there would be no Dante left to actually fight Mundus. She saves him at a pivotal moment, and ultimately everything does work out fine, leading us on to, of course, Mundus, demon god, lord of the underworld, and pretty much someone you're supposed to hate. Obviously he's trying to destroy the world, but he has no sense of respect for the people who serve him either. You get one chance, that's it, then you die because you have failed him. It's the kind of ruler that plot writers write because they need a simple villain with grand motives who you ultimately want to kill, and that would be Mundus. I think in his later incarnations in our future games he gets a bit more fun, but Mundus, simple but effective. Of course, the main enemies you fight from day to day throughout the game all have different traits and looks as well, and I think the prime enemy of the game that really sold me on this in the first place is the marionette enemy. Puppets that come to life and fight you. Evil, maybe, because they're soulless, they're controlled, and the direct machinations of Mundus themselves. He's directly trying to destroy Dante through his minions, and the puppet is a literal interpretation of that and a great metaphor for it overall. Of course, you've also got phantoms and shadow cats, dogs, and all sorts of other creatures as well that fight you during the game, but I think the marionette is perhaps the standout representative enemy of the original Devil May Cry, and it does a really good job doing it. You see a few at the start of the game before you get in your first combat scenario, and they're haunting then in the great macabre atmosphere of the castle, and it only gets better as time goes on. Of course, we also have our bosses as well, and this is perhaps where the original intentions of Resident Evil perhaps really start to filter through into the Devil May Cry games, because you see each boss 3 times, and while this works in a great narrative way for Dante to interact with them, as well as them to suddenly come back throwing new tricks at Dante, and you have to employ what you've learnt from fighting them the first time into fighting them the second and third times, it's also that thing that Resident Evil does, in that it really does reuse bosses quite a lot. You fight them several times before they ultimately die. In the case of Devil May Cry, you fight each boss 3 times before you're given onto the next boss of the 3 times, and so on and so forth. There's 3 main bosses that you fight repeatedly throughout the game, not including Nello Angelo, who fights you once in every act of the game. Each boss could be considered perhaps the bookend when you finally defeat them of each of the main chapters of the game's story. You go out in the castle, out the castle, and then into hell finally for the final boss, Nightmare. And you're also challenged differently between the bosses as well, with the first one being a more spider-like boss, the second one requiring guns because it's an aerial griffin boss, and the third one being something that requires a bit of strategy and puzzle solving as well. It cleverly mixes things up as it goes, and it makes sure that everything in the game keeps flowing with new ideas always coming afresh. Of course, the world itself as well is something that also really sticks in being something that's hung over Resident Evil. It being set in a castle seems the most obvious one, but the whole structure of the gameplay also works in that kind of respect as well. While the game is mission based, you find yourself backtracking a lot through the game as you find new keys to open new areas. Missions, while some can be short and others can be long, really do push you back and forth around the castle as you feel like you've really worked everything, and once you have, you move on to the next area, whether it be forests or eventually hell and its Divine Comedy references. Something that Devil May Cry doesn't have in spades, but there's clear inspirations are main characters, for example, or again, the literal hell. But there's other great set pieces as well, where you fight Griffin in various ruins, or you fight the giant spider on towers, or in hell, or swimming through a sunken galleon. It's really good in that it doesn't always stretch the macabre atmosphere, although some places really lay it on heavy. Other times it just puts you into great old 13th century atmosphere with really old structures that really feel like an island lost in time, which is perhaps what the game was ultimately going for, and something that would have felt quite in keeping with Resident Evil 2. However, of course, the game doesn't last forever. It's relatively short, and in a few hours, maybe 4 for your first playthrough, you'll probably find yourself getting through it. Of course, there's a lot to do. Devil May Cry brought in the idea of the post-game as well. While New Game Plus was never a thing, the post-game you're expected to try harder difficulties, keeping all your items for the first playthrough. Enemy patterns are interrupted, they are stronger, they hit harder, faster, and if you haven't been going through getting upgrades as well as you could, if you haven't got more health, you're probably going to find the steep difficulty curve jumping up into your first New Game Plus as you go into hard mode, something that's, well, really going to kick your ass. Obviously, there's an easy automatic mode in the game, something that I find is good for easing you into the game, or if you just want to see some stylish stuff of what you can do, but ultimately doesn't represent what you can do if you play the game manually on your own, and it's only usable in easy mode. The minute you step into normal or hard, you're going to find that if you don't know the combat system, you're going to start to suffer quite greatly. Of course, in easy automatic, what you don't get in regards to difficulty, you also lose out in regards to control. You have no real control over when Dante jumps during a combo because it's all automatic as well. It's a good trade-off. It means you're seeing some flashy stuff and you get to play the game, but the nuances of the combat system really don't come into their own when you're not directly controlling them. Of course, there's not just game difficulties that go up with that as well. You get the chance to finish up secret missions by going back and playing the game again on a harder difficulty, and you get more character options too, one of which is the chance to play as the legendary Dark Knight himself, Sparda, someone who's represented differently throughout the games, but in this game is represented in a human form as well, whether that's actually what he looks like or it's just something they did fun for the first game. But it's important to think about, because when it comes to talking about Devil May Cry 4, we'll get back to this interpretation of Sparda himself in his human form with his guns loose and Umbra. Of course, ultimately, Devil May Cry is seen as one of the defining franchises of the PlayStation 2, and this is where it started. It stepped out of what Resident Evil had become because, well, Resident Evil itself was evolving to become something new. But Resident Evil took a more survival action, whereas Devil May Cry went full on action with some survival horror elements in its actual design and artistic look. It made its own formula to a degree, but it's still very much steeped in what it was originally going to become. The sequel, on the other hand, Devil May Cry 2, is a bit of a different bag. It does a lot of things new, as we'll soon see, and that's mostly because the game itself was actually greenlit into development before the actual Devil May Cry 1 was finished, and therefore the team that works on it are completely different. It tries a different structure, different things with its characters, different ways of playing, and as you'll see, it's almost a completely different game that further defines the point that I made that Devil May Cry to this day still doesn't quite have a consistent mould it's going for. But we'll talk about that in the next video. Devil May Cry 2.
It looks like we have a winner.
Jackpot!